April 12, 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee. A low, late winter sun slanted through bare oak branches. The air tasted of coal smoke and wet earth. The freight car door clanged open and the world slid in. The stink of human bodies packed for days, the metallic tang of diesel, and an endless argument of voices. German, clipped and practiced, answering shouted orders in a language of ranks and vanished routines. Lieutenant Karl Müller pressed his forehead against the wooden slat as the ramp lowered. He wore a threadbare Feldgrau jacket, the collar too thin to keep out the cold. His M31 leather belt sagged under the weight of an empty canteen. Beside him, Unteroffizier Heinz Koch rubbed at a raw blister on his palm and spat into the packed dirt. They had been told the Americans were civil but odd, too loud, too big, too fat with food. They had been told the Americans were racially divided, weak because of it. What the men expected now was the same. A new prison, a new set of rules, a polished uniform of indignity to stand in. The platform was a mess of movement. Corporal James Jim Harris of the 125th Quartermaster waited with a clipboard, breath fogging. He had a close-cropped haircut, the sleeve of his OD olive drab shirt rolled to the elbow, and a coffee cup stained with grease. Nearby, Staff Sergeant Henry Wallace barked the register in a voice that could command a barnyard. The American guards wore M1 helmets and were careful to keep their boots free from blood and mud. Their mess kits clanked as they leaned against the rail and watched the Germans filter out. The first thing Karl noticed was not the guns or the guard towers. It was the smell, coffee so fresh it cut through the freight car musk, and something richer that made his mouth tighten. Frying bacon. In the distance, canvas mess tents billowed pale against the grey sky. Smoke rose in tidy columns from their chimneys. The camp was orderly, almost domestic in its small details. A wooden bulletin board nailed with typed lists, a line of latrine huts with proper doors, a small orchard where men in overalls pruned saplings as if tending something that might survive the war. Americans like their coffee, muttered Coke, the first English he could muster, more a pronunciation than a sentence. He flicked his eyes toward a mess tent where laughter leaked out. Karl followed. He had been fed propaganda for years. The Negroes in America were described to him by Nazi pamphlets as a spectacle, an object lesson in racial impurity the Reich could disdain. The expectation carved into his mind was, you will see separation, humiliation, disorder. Instead, the sight unstitched that certainty. Through the flap of the nearest tent, Karl saw lines of tables, long wooden planks on sawhorses, stamped with wartime ration numbers. Men sat shoulder to shoulder. Some were white and pale. Others were brown-faced and compact, with broad jaws and a different cadence of speech. The difference could have been dismissed as a detail of colonial maps, were it not for one small, immediate truth. They were eating from the same aluminum plates. A white corporal passed a loaf of bread down the same hand that held a spoon for a black private. People laughed on both sides of the table. They argued about the baseball game or a letter each had received. A sergeant in a bruised wool coat told a joke, and the sound traveled in both languages. A human noise, not an instruction. Karl's throat clenched. The Nazi lessons had been absolute, strength derived from purity, from the separation of peoples. Here was a contrary ledger. Efficiency, comradeship, and the practical oddity of American fraternization among troops of different colors. It didn't fit the models back home. A soldier's ration didn't read color. A wounded man didn't care who carried him. Coffee did not ask for a proof of Aryan lineage. Near the tent entrance, an American NCO, Staff Sergeant Wallace, caught Karl's eye and offered a nod. He looked neither mocking nor particularly civil, simply the way men who run a camp look, matter of fact and used to giving orders. "Line up there," Wallace said, his voice no softer but not cruel. He took a cigarette from a private, a black man with the rank of Private First Class named Samuel Jenkins, and lit it with one hand while handing paperwork to another. The small mechanics of human exchange, light for smoke, signature for name, played out as a simple machine that required no racial gears to function. Carl's left hand tightened on his canteen as the first forkful of scrambled eggs passed within reach. A black soldier at the table, short, with a high forehead and the tired look of someone who had been on the road too long, pushed a plate toward a pale man and said something in a profane, friendly voice. The pale man laughed, slapped the other on the shoulder and replied. Carl could not pass the words, but he recognized the rhythm, ribbing, a small bond of shared fatigue. Beneath the surface of the scene, there were smaller details that cut deeper. A white private carefully wiping a black comrade's spilled gravy as if it were no trouble. An older sergeant advising a younger private on how to patch a torn sleeve, while the private whose sleeve it was, black hands steady, listened and nodded. No raised voices about orders, no whispered admonitions to stay apart. Only ordinary work, ordinary jokes, ordinary food, stitching a different kind of order. As the Germans filed forward, the Americans called out names. Müller, Koch. The syllables fell with an odd lilt in the open air, a human roll that felt less like accusation and more like registration. When Carl stepped inside the tent, the heat and smell hit him full, bacon sizzling, coffee steaming, tobacco smoke braided with wood smoke. He set his plate on the table. Across from him sat Private Samuel Jenkins, calloused fingers, a dog-eared Bible folded under his elbow. Samuel gave him a look that was careful and curious, not hostile. Carl sat. He chewed and tried to sort out the new arithmetic of the world. The meal in his hand, the man across from him, the orders echoing from the tent flap. The contradiction made his mouth dry. Whatever judgment he had been taught had not accounted for a scene where appetite and hunger and the need to laugh at something small could erase an ideology's neat categories for a single afternoon. Carl Müller kept his eyes on the edge of his tray. Steam rose from the eggs in curling ribbons, and the bread was soft, real bread, not the sawdust-laced ration loaves from the front. He forced himself to chew slowly. Across from him, Private Samuel Jenkins finished his coffee, then looked up with a calm that seemed almost amused by Carl's stiffness. "You ain't from around here," Jenkins said, his southern accent broad, but his tone almost conversational. Carl blinked, uncertain if he should answer. He knew just enough English to understand the meaning, but the rhythm was strange, musical. He nodded stiffly. "German soldier." "Prisoner?" Jenkins grinned and leaned back, chair creaking. "Yeah, figured that much out." He gestured with his cup toward the group of POWs being seated further down the table. "You fellas fought hard. Didn't think we'd see you this far west." Carl hesitated. "You fight in Africa?" "Yep," Jenkins said, tapping his dog tag, Tuskegee. "Ground crew, then infantry. 92nd Division. They call us the Buffalo Soldiers now." Carl's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He had heard that word before. Buffalo Soldiers. In propaganda leaflets, they were used as proof of America's racial decline. Negro troops forced into battle by Jewish officers. But here, the man sat in a crisp olive-drab uniform, proud, fed, and joking with white soldiers who didn't seem to think anything of it. At the next table, a group of white guards traded stories with another black soldier, Private Ralph Thornton, about the previous night's baseball game broadcast from Nashville. One of them mimed a pitch and laughed so hard he nearly dropped his plate. The laughter rippled through the tent, loud and careless. To Carl, it was disorienting. The Third Reich had taught him to read the world through division. Here the categories blurred and bent until they lost meaning. A man was hungry or fed, tired or rested, quick with a joke or quiet with memory. Skin was a detail, like the shade of a uniform or the cut of a haircut. He didn't yet know that what he was witnessing wasn't complete equality, far from it. Outside this small camp bubble, America was still deeply segregated. But in the controlled, pragmatic world of the military, practicality sometimes won over prejudice. The army needed every capable man, and in places like Camp Forest, that reality surfaced in ways that shocked even its own citizens. Jenkins refilled his tin cup from a battered percolator, then pushed it toward Carl. "Coffee!" Carl hesitated again, then nodded. "Danke." The word drew a smile. "You're welcome," Jenkins said carefully, as if testing the sound in his mouth. The guards called time. Plates clattered, boots scraped, benches shifted. The POWs were lined up again, heading toward the barracks. As they filed out, Carl glanced back. Jenkins was already laughing with a new group of men, white and black mixed together, hands moving as he told a story Carl couldn't hear. Outside, the Tennessee sun had climbed higher, and the camp was stirring, work crews stacking lumber, others filling sandbags for new fences. A truck rumbled by with U.S. markings, carrying a load of coal. From somewhere down the slope, a harmonica began to play, a bright, wailing tune that might have been joy or sorrow or both. Koch fell into step beside Carl. "Strange people," he muttered in German. "They act as if they don't know who is better." Carl didn't answer. He could still taste the coffee, rich and unfamiliar, and hear the easy rhythm of voices at the table. Something in that moment, the absence of tension, the small kindnesses exchanged without thought, had cracked open a quiet doubt in him. That night, when the camp lamps dimmed and the guards made their final rounds, Carl lay awake on his bunk. From the next building came laughter again, an American guard sharing a story with another soldier. The voices were indistinct, one deeper, one lighter. Then silence, then a faint hum. Someone singing softly, a gospel tune perhaps. It was a sound Carl had never heard in his own army. There, songs were sharp-edged, full of command and certainty. This was different, melancholy, human and strange. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since his capture, he felt the smallest sliver of curiosity instead of resentment. What kind of country treated its prisoners better than its propaganda said it treated its own? That question would linger long after he left Camp Forest. Days turned into weeks. By early May, the cold Tennessee mornings had given way to warm air, heavy with pine resin and the smell of fresh-cut grass. The rhythm of the camp settled into something almost mechanical. Roll call, work detail, lunch, inspection, lights out. But inside that routine, something subtle began to shift in the minds of the captured Germans. Karl Müller no longer stared at the barbed wire each dawn. He stared instead at the kitchen tents, where steam rose from cauldrons of oatmeal and bacon grease. The kitchen was run by a rotating staff, black, white, and even a few Mexican-American soldiers, all working side by side in a syncopated dance of ladles, shouts, and laughter. The first time Carl had been assigned to help clean the mess hall, he expected strict separation. Instead, Sergeant Wallace had paired him with Jenkins again. Jenkins wore an apron dusted with flour. His sleeves rolled high as he scrubbed pans in rhythm with a radio tune. "Hey, Carl," Jenkins said without looking up, "you ever cook at home?" Carl shook his head. "My mother, not me." Jenkins chuckled. "Figures. My mama wouldn't let me near her kitchen either. Said I'd burn the house down." The exchange seemed ordinary, but to Carl it was extraordinary. A conversation without power, without hierarchy. Jenkins teased him the same way he teased his fellow Americans. To be spoken to like a man, not an enemy, not a racial category. It scraped away a layer of everything he had been told about inferior peoples. He saw it again that afternoon when a black mechanic from the motor pool stopped by with a busted truck carburetor. The man asked Wallace for a wrench, and Wallace tossed it without a second thought. No sneer, no hesitation, just efficiency. The Americans valued what worked. That night, as the camp quieted under a waxing moon, Carl sat on the barracks step with Coke. The insects hummed, and from a nearby hut came the low sound of a guitar. An American guard playing slow blues, the notes curling and falling like drifting smoke. Koch scowled. They pretend to be equal. But look at them. The Negroes still do the cleaning, the cooking, the menial jobs. They just hide it behind smiles. Carl looked down, turning the thought over. It wasn't untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The roles seemed to shift constantly. Jenkins gave orders to white privates when running his work crew. The guard who'd played the guitar earlier, White from Kansas, had taken his turn scrubbing floors the day before. In Germany, order was rigid, absolute. Here it flexed like the rhythm of that guitar, sometimes harsh, sometimes soft, always finding a way forward. 2 nights later, a storm rolled through. Rain hammered the tin roofs, thunder cracked across the hills, and lightning split the sky wide open. In the barracks, the power flickered and went out. The POWs muttered in the dark, restless. Then came a familiar sound, the echo of boots and the creak of the door. It was Jenkins again, carrying a lantern and a small box of candles. "Y'all all right in here?" he asked. A murmur of assent came from the bunks. Jenkins grinned and set the light on a crate. "Guess the storm's taken a shot at us." When a gust blew the door wide open, Jenkins leaned into it, pushing it shut. Carl instinctively moved to help, bracing the frame beside him. The wind soaked them both in seconds, but they managed to secure the latch. For a moment they stood there, breathing hard, dripping rainwater, two silhouettes in the lamplight. Jenkins laughed softly. "Man, that Tennessee weather don't play fair." Carl found himself smiling back. "No, it does not." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it echoed in Carl's memory long after the rain stopped. It wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about decency. Two men holding a door against the storm. When morning came, the air smelled of wet soil and pine. The camp stirred, and life resumed its rhythm. But in Carl's mind, the picture had already shifted. The idea that races could cooperate, could share danger, laughter, and even exhaustion, no longer seemed like chaos. It felt natural. He noticed how even his fellow POWs began to soften. A few traded cigarettes with the American guards. One, a baker from Munich, offered to help in the camp kitchen and ended up learning how to make cornbread. Another found himself talking baseball with a white corporal who'd played in the minor leagues. By June, small moments of humanity had done what propaganda could not undo with violence. They had redefined the enemy. Carl still wrote letters home when allowed, filling the pages with careful words the censors would approve. But between the lines, a quiet realization began to grow, that perhaps the Reich's certainty about racial hierarchy had been a lie built on fear. He didn't write that down, of course. He only wrote, "The Americans are different than we expected." The next morning, the air was sharp and cold enough to make breath visible. Dew gathered along the barbed wire that ringed the compound, glinting like frost. Reveille sounded over a tinny loudspeaker, followed by the distant clatter of mess kits and the rumble of trucks from the motor pool. Carl Miller and Heinz Koch joined a line of POWs assigned to labor detail, repairing a section of fencing near the camp's storage yard. An American guard led them there, Sergeant Henry Wallace, the same one who'd overseen their arrival. He walked with a steady gait, his M1 slung casually over his shoulder, the brim of his helmet shadowing his face. He was not cruel, not lenient, simply professional, the kind of man who carried authority without effort. What caught Carl's eye that morning wasn't Wallace, but the man beside him, Private First Class Jenkins. Same easy stride, same coffee cup in one hand, rifle hanging loose in the other. They were talking like old friends, two voices passing stories across the hum of diesel engines. "Wallace," Jenkins said, "you ever seen snow like this back home?" The sergeant grinned. "In Kentucky, yeah." "Ain't nothing new?" Jenkins shook his head. "Well, down in Georgia, snow's like a rumor. Folks talk about it, but it never shows up." Carl understood fragments of their speech, enough to catch the teasing rhythm. They spoke like equals, but it was more than that. The white sergeant didn't speak down to the black private, didn't correct him, didn't posture. It was a simple thing, and yet for Carl, it jarred against everything he had been taught. As the Germans worked, Jenkins crouched beside the fence to inspect their progress. He pointed to where the wire sagged. "Needs tightening," he said. "Here, look." He motioned for Carl to hold one end of the pliers. Together, they pulled the strand, taut metal biting into their palms. "Good," Jenkins said, nodding once. Carl felt a strange flicker of embarrassment, then gratitude. In the Wehrmacht, a non-Aryan would not have been allowed to speak to him, much less instruct him with calm patience. Yet here was an American who had fought in uniform, giving him advice like a craftsman, not a conqueror. Koch muttered in German from behind him. "They make them equal to whites?" "Madness," Carl said nothing. He couldn't bring himself to agree. At noon, the work detail broke for lunch under the shade of a supply shed. The Americans shared rations, bread, apples, and a kind of sweet, sticky spread they called peanut butter. Jenkins tossed a jar toward the Germans with a grin. You ain't lived till you had this." The POWs stared. Carl unscrewed the lid and sniffed cautiously. It smelled of roasted nuts and sugar. He tasted a little on the tip of his spoon and froze. It was delicious. Jenkins laughed at the look on his face. "Told you!" Coke rolled his eyes. "Child's food," he muttered in German. But Carl ignored him, dipping the spoon again. The easy camaraderie around the shed was unforced. A few American soldiers shared cigarettes. A radio played faintly from the truck cab. Glenn Miller's orchestra, Moonlight Serenade, its smooth swing drifting over the camp. Even the guards seemed to relax, leaning back against the wall, rifles propped at their sides. Jenkins lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "You know," he said, glancing at Carl, "back home, folks like me still gotta sit at the back of buses. Can't eat in some restaurants? Ain't right, but that's how it is." Carl frowned. "But here," Jenkins said, tapping his uniform, "I wear the same flag they do. Out there on the line, ain't nobody asking what color you are when you're catching shells." Carl's mind struggled to hold the contradiction. Back home, equality among races was supposed to mean chaos, the destruction of civilization. Yet here sat a man who could joke, work, and even share food with his supposed superiors, and the world didn't seem to collapse for it. It wasn't perfection, Carl could tell. There were still moments, side glances, quiet silences that hinted at tensions he couldn't fully grasp. But there was also something new, something he had never witnessed in Germany, coexistence, imperfect but real. When the bell sounded to end the break, Jenkins stood, brushed dust from his trousers and said, "All right, boys, let's make it tight enough to keep a cat out." Carl smiled before he could stop himself. That afternoon, when the POWs were marched back toward their barracks, the fence they repaired gleamed in the low sun, straight, taut, secure. Wallace gave an approving nod, Jenkins raised a hand in casual salute, and Carl found himself returning the gesture almost unconsciously. It was a small motion, but for him it marked a quiet shift, an understanding that the world might be larger, messier, and far more humane than the one he had been ordered to believe in. By late summer of 1944, the Tennessee heat pressed heavy on the camp. Cicadas screamed from the trees, the air shimmered above the gravel roads, and sweat slicked every man's neck. The war in Europe was shifting. News filtered through the camp like the pulse of a distant storm. Normandy had been invaded. Paris was said to be falling. The Reich was cracking piece by piece. The prisoners heard rumors through guards and Red Cross bulletins, but no one spoke of it directly. Instead, they worked. They repaired fences, hauled timber, or helped local farmers bring in crops under watchful eyes. Karl Müller found himself assigned to the motor pool, where engines were always growling and grease clung to everything like a second skin. Jenkins worked there too. Sleeves rolled, chest glistening in the heat, a wrench in one hand, and a grin that made everything look easy. One afternoon, as Carl tightened bolts on a Jeep's suspension, a radio crackled nearby. The announcer's voice came faint through the static. "Allied forces have liberated Rome." Then Glenn Miller's. In the mood burst out bright and brassy, and the whole garage seemed to hum with it. Jenkins chuckled. "Guess it won't be long now, huh?" Carl didn't answer. He stared at the oily wrench in his hands, at the rhythmic tapping of Jenkins' boot, keeping time with the music. There was no triumph in his chest anymore, just exhaustion and something quieter, respect. That night, Carl sat at a wooden table in the dim barracks and wrote a letter. The paper was thin, his pencil dull. "To my brother Wilhelm, you will laugh, but the Americans, they are not what we were told. They are strong, yes, but not cruel. Their soldiers, even the colored ones, are treated better than we expected. I saw a black man give orders to white men, and they listened without protest. It confused me at first. Now I think perhaps it makes them stronger. They are united in a way we are not." He paused, staring at the half-written page. He wanted to say more, that he had eaten meals beside those men, that he had come to know one of them by name, that he had felt a strange sense of equality in their shared labor, but he knew the censors would never let it pass. So he crossed out the last line and ended simply, "The world is not as we were told." He folded the letter, sealed it, and handed it to the camp clerk the next morning. The war dragged on, but time in captivity dulled its edges. By winter, the POWs had built small gardens between barracks, traded carvings for cigarettes, and even staged plays for the guards' amusement. Life continued in small, stubborn ways. Jenkins was reassigned in December, transferred north to another camp in Illinois. On his last morning, he stopped by the barracks carrying a paper bag. "Got something for you," he said, handing Carl a folded slip of cardboard, a label torn from a coffee can. On it, he'd written in block letters, "Good luck, friend. Try the peanut butter again when you get home." Carl laughed, an honest, quiet sound, and shook his hand. It felt strange to touch the hand of a man who, by Nazi doctrine, should not have existed in uniform. Yet in that handshake, there was no question of worth, just two men who had survived different storms. Months later, when the war ended and the camp gates finally opened, the trucks that carried the prisoners home moved slowly through lines of waving civilians. Some POWs cheered, some sang, but Carl sat silently, the cardboard note tucked in his breast pocket. He thought of Camp Forest, the smell of coffee, the laughter across tables, the thunderstorm night when he'd helped hold a door against the wind. When he finally reached Germany, the cities were rubble, and the air smelled of smoke and surrender. The Reich that had promised purity lay broken. At home, his brother Wilhelm asked the inevitable question, "Did they treat you badly?" Carl looked out at the grey ruins and said softly, "No, they treated me like a man." He said nothing of the shock, the confusion, the quiet education of captivity, how an enemy's kindness had dismantled a lifetime of lies. He simply placed Jenkins' note in a drawer and kept it there for the rest of his life. And years later, when his own son asked him what surprised him most about the war, Carl answered without hesitation, "It wasn't the guns or the bombs or even the defeat. It was seeing men of different colors sharing bread and realizing that was the thing we feared most."